So this is the lecture for Public Policy, Week 2, Lecture number 2, Part B. So in the previous part to this lecture, we were talking about the environment in which policymakers work. And we were analyzing the author's, Professor Peters' approach to the political environment. But I believe there are some additional factors that should be considered when we look at the political environment and the impact that political environment has on policymakers and their decisions. First of all, I would argue that there's a strong sense of individualism in the United States that is part of the political culture. Secondly, a strong belief in the capitalist system as the way to form the economy, a capitalist system based on the private ownership of property. Thirdly, a strong belief in equality of opportunity as manifested in opportunities for education, employment, and so on. Fourth, a lack of trust in government and in government officials. And fifth, extreme fragmentation of the policymaking structure. Let's talk first about individualism. Individualism assumes that people are basically rational and therefore capable of participating in the political system because they're rational and they're intelligent. But secondly, if they're rational and intelligent, they're also capable of providing for their own needs. There is a strong negative bias in the United States against people on welfare programs, such as public assistance. And here we have to the right a photograph of a game that came out, a board game that mimicked Monopoly, but it was a game that ridiculed welfare recipients. Secondly, we have a pretty strong belief in capitalism as the best way to form an economy, and associated with that, the ownership of private property. Thirdly, we have a pretty strong belief, even among conservatives as well as liberals, that we should have a system of equal opportunity. For example, all students should have an equal opportunity to apply for admission to university, but the university should only accept those who are the best qualified. So we have to emphasize the word opportunity. Americans believe in equality of opportunity. Fourthly, trust in government, or as you can see from this graph, a lack of trust in government. So this graph goes back to the late 1950s and comes up to 2017. And you see a downward trajectory in trust among both Republicans and Democrats, trust towards presidents. You see it goes up in the Reagan years, comes back down in the first Bush year, comes up slightly during the Clinton years, and back down during the Bush years, and down during the Obama years. So basically, fewer than 30% of both Republicans and Democrats really have much trust in whoever is president at the present time. A fifth factor that we need to add to the analysis made by the author of the textbook is that the policymaking process in the United States is extremely fragmented. It's fragmented because we have a federal form of government, because we have a system of separation of powers, because we have what are sometimes called sub-governments and also called iron triangles, and we have the blurring of government and the private sector. So let's look first of all at the causes of federalism and the fragmentation that results, as it is caused by the federal structure of government. In a federal system, power is shared by at least two levels of government. Originally, the U.S. Constitution only divided power between the federal government and the state governments, and did not even mention local governments. But now we consider federalism to include the national, the states, and the local governments. But remember, that's not what was originally in the Constitution. So I'd like to talk for a moment about the stages of federalism. And we're going to talk primarily about two stages of federalism, from the founding of the nation up to the 1930s, which some political scientists like to describe as a layer cake. And the analogy is that you have at least two layers in your cake divided by frosting. And at the time that we had dual federalism, there was relatively little interaction between the national government in Washington, D.C., also called the federal government, and the state governments in their state capitals. Each layer had its own separate sphere of power and separate sphere of policymaking. But then comes the Great Depression and a new period of federalism that we call cooperative federalism from the 1930s up to the present time. Political scientists like to describe this as a marble cake because there's a great deal of interaction and cooperation between the national government, also called the federal government, between the national government, the state governments, and also the local governments. Cooperative federalism is characterized by a transfer of money, usually from the national government to the state government or to the local governments. And this is particularly true when the federal government wants the states to do something. They want them to adopt a certain program. They want them to implement a certain federal policy. The federal government tends to hand out money when they want state and local governments to do something on their behalf. Okay, the author of the text, Peters, also discusses what he calls picket fence federalism. We're not really going to go into picket fence federalism in this class, so you can just skip that part. Okay, so we're fragmented by a federal form of government, a sharing of powers between the national, state, and local governments, but we're also fragmented by the separation of powers, the separation between the legislative branch, the executive branch, i.e. the president, and the judicial branch, the courts, and particularly the U.S. Supreme Court. Each of these branches has a check on the other two branches of government, and basically the president and the Congress have to reach an agreement for a policy to be enacted. And even if they do reach an agreement, there is still the risk that the courts will declare the policy to be unconstitutional. The author of your textbook, Peters, talks about subgovernments as contributing to fragmentation. And the same concept is also called the iron triangle. What this means is that if non-government organizations like interest groups pressure Congress and pressure government bureaucratic agencies to do certain things, the likelihood is pretty high that whatever they're after, they're going to get. In other words, the policy-making process becomes even more fragmented when these outside interest groups develop close relationships with the members of Congress and with people in the president's administration, i.e. the bureaucracy. We call it an iron triangle because if the relationship is very strong, policy is probably going to be enacted. Because if the relationship is very strong, the policy is probably going to be enacted. So, for example, if you get an agreement among an interest group like the American Association of Retired Persons with members of Congress who sit on the subcommittees that deal with Social Security and the Social Security Administration, if you get them all to support a proposed Congress, it's very likely that that proposal will actually be enacted. Now, the blurring of government between the public and the private sectors. Back to Peters again. He also argues that the policymaking process is further fragmented because so many non-government employees are delivering government programs. The government contracts out for a lot of services. For example, most universities, including the University of South Florida, don't run their own food service programs. They contract out who specialize in food service delivery at universities. Thanks for watching.